May, we'll start a new life. Just you and me, Caleb said, his voice so convincing that I couldn't help but smile. My stepfather's words felt like a warm embrace, something I'd rarely felt in my life. Mom never tried to understand me, and Caleb? He saw me. Truly saw me. I remember the day Mom announced their marriage. To her, it was another notch in her belt of accomplishments, something to flaunt at her social circle. But to me, Caleb was the only one who cared. He listened when no one else would, and when he told me we were leaving this place behind, I didn't hesitate. May, you deserve more, he'd said, his voice filled with an earnestness that made my chest ache. I believed him. Everything was packed, and the air buzzed with a sense of liberation. But then, on the day of the move, Mom climbed into the car with us. Her smile was tight, calculated, as if she'd orchestrated this whole thing. Caleb's face remained composed, but I caught the briefest flicker of tension in his jaw. Something felt off. The drive was suffocating. Mom filled the silence with her usual chatter, talking about plans she never consulted us on. Caleb's hands gripped the wheel a little tighter each time she spoke, but he said nothing. I stayed silent too, my mind racing with questions I didn't dare voice. Why was she here? This was supposed to be our escape, not hers. When we arrived at the new house, my excitement should have eclipsed the unease, but it didn't. The house was stunning, modern, spacious, with large windows that let in endless light. It looked like the fresh start Caleb had promised. But the tension between him and Mom clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. The first few days were uneventful, at least on the surface. Caleb was busy setting things up, ensuring everything was perfect. Mom, however, seemed determined to assert her presence, reorganizing furniture and making decisions without consulting anyone. I could see the frustration simmering in Caleb's eyes, but he never said a word. One evening, as I was unpacking in my room, I heard raised voices from downstairs. Mom's sharp tone cut through the walls. This isn't just your decision, Caleb. Don't forget who's funding all this. His reply was quieter, more measured, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart raced. What were they arguing about? I pressed my ear against the door, but the voices faded, leaving me with more questions than answers. The next morning, Caleb knocked on my door. Hey, May, he said, his smile softer than usual. Do you want to go out today? Just us? I nodded eagerly, desperate for a reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere in the house. As we drove into town, Caleb's usual calm demeanor returned. He pointed out landmarks, told stories, and for a moment it felt like everything was normal. But then, as we stopped at a cafe, he leaned in closer. May, you know you can trust me, right? The question caught me off guard. Of course, I said, frowning. Why? He hesitated, his fingers drumming on the table. Sometimes, adults make choices that aren't easy to explain. But I need you to know, everything I do, it's for you. His words lingered with me long after we returned home. That night, I heard him on the phone, his voice low but urgent. I couldn't make out everything he said, but one name stood out, Amelia. My chest tightened. Who was she? Over the next few days, I started noticing things I'd overlooked before. The way Caleb's phone seemed to buzz constantly, how he'd step out of the room to take certain calls. And then there were the papers in his office. I'd stumbled upon them by accident while looking for tape to seal a box. Among them was a document addressed to Amelia. My heart pounded as I stared at the name. That evening, I tried to act normal at dinner, but my mind was spinning. Caleb, I ventured, keeping my tone casual, do we know anyone else around here? Like, any friends or family? He paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. No, he said finally, his voice steady. Why do you ask? I shrugged, pretending it was nothing. But his answer didn't sit right. He'd lied. I was sure of it. The next few nights, I barely slept. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Who was Amelia? What was Caleb hiding? And why did I feel like everything I'd believed about him was starting to unravel? One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I crept downstairs to his office, my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and light spilled into the hallway. I peered inside and saw him, sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. He looked defeated. Before I could decide whether to confront him, he spoke, his voice low and filled with anguish. I'm trying to fix this, Amelia. But it's not easy. May's already suspicious. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He was talking to her. The woman whose name haunted me. My mind reeled. What was he fixing? And why was I the one he was worried about? The sound of his chair scraping against the floor snapped me out of my thoughts. I hurried back upstairs, my heart racing. I couldn't confront him. Not yet. I needed to know more. But one thing was clear, this new life wasn't the escape I dreamed of. It was a web of secrets, and I was caught in the middle. And something told me the worst was yet to come. The new house was enormous, filled with light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, but something about it felt off. It wasn't just the unfamiliarity of a new place. No, it was deeper, like an unseen shadow lurking in every corner. Caleb seemed preoccupied, his usual warmth dulled by some unseen burden. He often left me at home alone, excusing himself with vague mentions of work matters. And then there was Mom. She strutted around the house like she had conquered it, moving furniture, criticizing Caleb's choices, and pretending as if we'd all willingly followed her into this new chapter. I kept my distance, avoiding her sharp remarks and the cold indifference that always lingered between us. Left alone, my curiosity began to fester. Questions about Caleb's increasingly strange behavior gnawed at me. Where was he going? Who was he talking to on the phone late at night? And why did he seem more distant every time he came back? One day, while he was out, I wandered into his study. The door creaked slightly as I pushed it open, revealing an organized chaos of papers, books, and folders. I told myself I was just curious, there was no harm in looking. But deep down, I knew I was searching for something, even if I wasn't sure what. On the desk, half hidden beneath a stack of documents, I found an envelope addressed to someone named Margot. My pulse quickened as I opened it. Inside were letters and photographs, images of a woman I didn't recognize. She was beautiful, with a radiant smile and eyes that seemed to hide 1,000 secrets. Who was she? I whispered, my hands trembling as I flipped through the contents. Each photo, each word on the page, felt like a piece of a puzzle I wasn't ready to complete. When Caleb returned that evening, his calm demeanor made my stomach churn. As we sat across from each other at dinner, I couldn't help but study his face. Was he lying to me? Was the man I trusted keeping secrets? You seem quiet tonight, he remarked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. I hesitated, unsure if I should confront him. Just thinking about everything, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. He nodded, but I saw the flicker of concern in his expression. And then, as if reading my thoughts, he leaned forward slightly. May, you already suspect something, don't you? His words froze me. My breath caught, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. How much did he know? How much could he see? My voice faltered, and I dropped my gaze to the table. It's okay, he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. But there was something behind his eyes, something that didn't match his words. You can always talk to me. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I avoided his gaze, retreating to my room the moment dinner ended. My mind raced as I replayed his words. Was he trying to manipulate me? Or was I imagining things? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house felt amplified, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of Caleb's voice as he spoke on the phone. I crept to my door and pressed my ear against it, straining to hear. She's suspicious, he said, his tone hushed but firm. No, I haven't told her. She's too smart to ignore this forever. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. He was talking about me. But who was he talking to? Margot? The name echoed in my mind, intertwining with every doubt I'd tried to suppress. The next day, I decided I needed answers. While Caleb and Mom were out, I returned to his study. This time, I wasn't just curious, I was determined. I rifled through drawers, scanned his computer, and combed through every folder I could find. And then I found it. A file labeled Margot, Personal. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside were documents detailing financial transactions, messages exchanged, and itineraries for trips Caleb had taken. It was all connected to her. My stomach churned as I pieced it together. This wasn't just a casual acquaintance. Margot was someone important to him, someone he was hiding from me and Mom. When he came home that evening, I couldn't bring myself to face him. I stayed in my room, pretending to read while my mind spiraled. The trust I'd placed in him felt like a fragile thread, fraying with every new revelation. But Caleb wasn't oblivious. Later that night, he knocked on my door. "May, can we talk?" I hesitated before opening it, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. "I feel like something's bothering you," he said, his eyes searching mine. "If there's anything you want to say, now's the time." The weight of the file I'd found pressed on me, but I couldn't bring myself to confront him. "Not yet. I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just adjusting to everything." He studied me for a moment, and I thought he might push further. But then he nodded. "Okay," he said softly. "Just remember, you can always trust me." As he left the room, I let out a shaky breath. Trust him? How could I, when every instinct screamed that he was hiding something? The days that followed were a blur of tension and suspicion. I watched Caleb more closely, noticing the subtle ways he avoided questions, the moments he slipped away to take calls. And then there was Mom, oblivious as ever, too caught up in her own world to notice the cracks forming around her. One evening, I caught Caleb staring at me from across the room. His gaze was intense, filled with something I couldn't quite decipher. Was it guilt? Worry? Or something else entirely? I didn't know what scared me more, the secrets he was keeping, or the possibility that I was becoming a part of them. One thing was certain, whatever was happening, it was far from over. And I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it cost me. Mom became colder, more distant than ever. Her words, when she spoke to me, were clipped and impersonal, like I was just another inconvenience in her life. It wasn't a surprise, she had always been that way, but now, in this massive new house, her detachment felt even more suffocating. Caleb, on the other hand, was different. He spent more time with me, his presence warm and grounding. He had a way of making me feel like I mattered, something I hadn't felt in years. When he wasn't running errands or locked in tense phone calls, he invited me to his study. At first, I hesitated. His study felt like forbidden territory, but he insisted. "Come in, May," he'd say with a soft smile. "There's nothing here you can't see." He showed me papers, contracts, plans, and emails. Most of it went over my head, filled with technical jargon I didn't understand. But as he explained each document, his voice steady and patient, I realized this wasn't about teaching me business. It was about trust. He wanted me to feel included, to know I was someone he valued. "You're special, May," he said one evening, his voice quieter than usual. He reached out, his hand lightly brushing mine. The touch sent a ripple of tension through me, one that lingered long after I left his study. That night, I couldn't sleep. His words, his touch, they replayed in my mind, looping endlessly. It wasn't wrong, I told myself. Caleb had always been kind to me, always made me feel seen in a way Mom never could. If anything, I should have felt grateful. But there was something more, something unspoken, that kept me awake. The next morning, Caleb greeted me in the kitchen with a smile, as if nothing had changed. Mom was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in her room or out somewhere, basking in the attention of strangers. "May," Caleb said, his tone gentle, "do you want to help me with something later? I could use your input." My input. The word struck me as strange, but I agreed. Anything to escape the suffocating loneliness of this house. When I joined him in his study later that day, he was already seated, a pile of documents spread across the desk. He motioned for me to sit beside him. "I need a second opinion," he said, sliding a folder toward me. I opened it, scanning the pages. It was a proposal of some sort, though the details were unclear to me. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to give advice on this," I admitted. "You are," he insisted, his eyes meeting mine. "You see things others don't. That's why I trust you." His words left me momentarily stunned. Trust. It was such a simple word, yet coming from him, it felt monumental. As the days went on, these moments between us became more frequent. Caleb would call me into his study to review something or ask for my opinion. Sometimes, we'd sit in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. Other times, he'd share stories from his past, fragments of his life that felt oddly intimate. Meanwhile, Mom's absence grew more pronounced. She rarely joined us for meals and barely acknowledged my existence. If she noticed the growing bond between Caleb and me, she didn't show it. Or maybe she just didn't care. One evening, as we sat in the study, Caleb leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder why people drift apart?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Your mother and I, we were never really close. Not the way a husband and wife should be. It's like we're strangers living under the same roof." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault. But another part of me, the part that remembered all the times Mom ignored me, dismissed me, felt a strange sense of satisfaction. "It's not easy," he continued, his voice quieter now. "Feeling like you're invisible to the person who's supposed to care the most." I swallowed hard, his words hitting closer to home than I expected. "I know what that's like," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "I know you do," he said softly. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. When he reached out, his hand resting gently on mine, I didn't pull away. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Caleb's words, his touch, lingered in my mind like a song I couldn't stop replaying. I felt no guilt, no shame. If anything, I felt justified. Mom had forfeited any claim to my loyalty long ago. But the questions remained. What was Caleb's endgame? Why was he so invested in me? And why did I feel like the ground beneath me was shifting with every passing day? The answers felt just out of reach, tantalizing and terrifying all at once. Whatever was happening between us, it was far from over. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. It all unraveled that night in Caleb's study. The air felt heavy, charged with an intensity one couldn't quite explain. I sat beside him, the warmth of his hand resting on my knee anchoring me in place. We were reviewing papers, or at least pretending to. I was hyper-aware of every subtle movement, every word left unsaid. Then the door burst open. "May? Caleb?" Mom's sharp voice sliced through the tension. My heart leaped into my throat as I turned toward her, standing frozen in the doorway. Her eyes darted between us, narrowing when they landed on his hand. "What are you doing?" she hissed, storming toward us. Caleb didn't flinch. Calmly, he stood, his hand slipping from my knee but taking mine in his instead. The gesture felt deliberate, a silent declaration. "What am I doing?" he repeated, his voice steady but firm. "I'm choosing someone who actually understands me." Mom's face twisted in disbelief, a mixture of anger and shock clouding her expression. "You're out of your mind," she spat, her voice trembling. This is ridiculous." Caleb didn't waver. His grip on my hand tightened slightly, a reassuring pressure that steadied my racing heart. "Ridiculous," he echoed, his gaze locked on hers. "What's ridiculous is pretending we've ever been anything more than strangers. This marriage has been a farce from the start." Her composure cracked. I'd never seen Mom like this, so visibly shaken, so utterly lost for words. Usually, she was in control, her confidence a wall no one could breach. But now, that wall was crumbling. "You're throwing everything away," she said, her voice breaking. "For what?" "For huh?" She pointed at me, her tone dripping with venom. "For someone who cares," Caleb replied evenly. His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I couldn't look at her. Shame and defiance battled within me, twisting my stomach into knots. Part of me wanted to stand up, to defend myself, but another part was paralyzed, unable to move under her piercing gaze. "You've lost your mind," Mom said again, but this time her voice wavered. She looked at me, her expression hardening into something cold, calculating. "And you? You think this is love? He's using you, May. Just like he's used everyone else." "That's enough," Caleb interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. "Don't turn this into something it's not. You've ignored her for years, treated her like she didn't exist. Don't act like you care now." The words hit her like a slap. For a moment, she looked as though she might cry, but then her face hardened again. "You'll regret this," she said quietly, her voice like ice. Caleb's expression didn't change. "Pack your things," he said, his tone calm but resolute. "It's time for you to leave." The silence that followed was deafening. Mom stood there, staring at him as though trying to decide whether to fight back. But then she turned, storming out of the room without another word. The sound of her heels echoing down the hall sent a shiver through me. I sat there, frozen, as Caleb turned back to me. His hand found mine again, his touch grounding me in the chaos. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. "What happens now?" I whispered. He gave me a small, reassuring smile. "We move forward," he said simply. The hours that followed were a blur. Mom stayed in her room, the door slammed shut. I could hear her pacing, the occasional sound of drawers opening and closing as she packed her things. Caleb stayed close to me, his presence steady and calming. When Mom finally emerged, her face was a mask of anger and defeat. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't even look at me. As she walked out the door, suitcase in hand, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and something darker, something almost triumphant. For years, I had watched her take everything for granted: her relationships, her family, her life. And now, for the first time, she was the one losing. After the door closed, Caleb turned to me, his expression softening. "It's just us now," he said quietly. "Are you ready for that?" I nodded, though the weight of his words settled heavily in my chest. Was I ready? I didn't know. But as his hand found mine again, I felt a flicker of certainty. Whatever came next, I wasn't alone. That night, the house was eerily quiet. Caleb and I sat together in the living room, the silence between us comfortable but charged. I couldn't shake the image of Mom's face as she left, the look of defeat in her eyes. It should have made me feel guilty, but it didn't. For the first time, I felt free. But freedom, I realized, came with its own complications. Caleb's presence was comforting, yes, but it was also a reminder of the choices we'd made. Choices that couldn't be undone. As the night stretched on, I found myself wondering, was this really the beginning of something new? Or was it the start of something I couldn't control? One thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And deep down, I knew the consequences of this night would follow us both, no matter how much we tried to move forward. Mom left the next day without a word. She didn't look at me as she walked out the door, suitcase in hand. I expected to feel relief, but instead, there was an emptiness that settled in her absence. The house, now quiet and still, felt foreign. That evening, Caleb prepared dinner for the two of us. The table, usually filled with awkward silences and sharp remarks from Mom, now felt different. The tension between us wasn't hostile, it was heavy, charged with something unspoken. I could feel his eyes on me as we ate, though I avoided meeting his gaze. After dinner, we retreated to the living room. Caleb sat beside me on the couch, closer than usual. The warmth of his presence made the silence almost unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "May, there's something I've been meaning to tell you." I turned to him, my breath catching. His hand lightly touched my shoulder, and for a moment, I felt frozen, unsure of what was about to happen. But instead of waiting, I leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't something I'd even thought about. It just happened, as naturally as breathing. Caleb didn't pull away. His hand slid around my waist, and suddenly, everything felt inevitable. That night, we crossed a line we could never uncross. It wasn't just physical, it was the culmination of months of unspoken words, glances that lingered too long, and a bond that defied every rule. As I lay in his arms afterward, I felt no guilt, no regret. For the first time in years, I felt seen. But the next morning, reality hit like a cold wave. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows, Caleb's arms still draped over me. The events of the night before replayed in my mind, and a pit formed in my stomach. Was this what I truly wanted? Or had I let my anger toward Mom drive me to something I couldn't undo? I slipped out of bed, wrapping myself in a blanket as I stared out the window. The weight of my decision settled heavily on my shoulders. When Caleb woke up, he found me in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of coffee. He walked up behind me, his arms wrapping around my waist. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice soft. For a moment, I leaned into him, letting myself believe this was the start of something new, something good. But deep down, a shadow of doubt lingered. What if this wasn't the escape I thought it was? The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. Caleb acted as if nothing had changed, his usual calm demeanor unshaken. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something dangerous. That night, as we sat together in the living room, he looked at me with a seriousness that sent a shiver down my spine. "May, I need you to know something," he said. I braced myself, my heart pounding. "What is it?" He hesitated, his expression conflicted. "What happened between us? It wasn't a mistake. I don't regret it. But I need to know that you're okay with this." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach tightened. "I am," I said, though I wasn't sure if it was entirely true. But before the conversation could go any further, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made us both freeze. I turned to Caleb, confusion and fear flashing across my face. "Who could that be?" I whispered. He stood, his expression darkening as he moved toward the window. When he pulled back the curtain, his face went pale. "It's your mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart sank. She was supposed to be gone. She'd left without a word. So why was she back? The doorbell rang, its sharp chime cutting through the silence. Caleb turned to me, his jaw tight. "Stay here," he said firmly, heading toward the door. But I couldn't just sit there. I followed him, my pulse racing as he opened the door. Mom stood on the porch, her expression cold and unyielding. "I'm not here to stay," she said, her voice sharp. "I just came to collect what's mine." Her eyes flicked to me, and for the first time, I saw something in her gaze that wasn't anger or indifference. It was something darker, calculated and dangerous. As she stepped inside, I realized this wasn't over. Not even close. Caleb's posture stiffened as Mom stepped inside, her sharp heels clicking against the wooden floor. She carried a small suitcase, but her intentions were far heavier than mere luggage. "I know what you've done," she said, her gaze cutting through both of us. Her voice was icy, devoid of the maternal warmth I'd never really known. Caleb didn't respond immediately. Instead, he crossed his arms, standing protectively in front of me. "You've already lost, so why are you here?" he asked, his tone steady but guarded. Mom's laugh was bitter, almost mocking. "You think you've won? This isn't about you, Caleb. It's about her." She pointed at me, her eyes narrowing. "May, you're nothing but a pawn to him. Do you really think he cares about you?" Her words hit like a slap, but Caleb didn't waver. "Leave her out of this," he said firmly. Mom ignored him, stepping closer to me. "He's using you, May. Just like he used me. And when he's done, he'll toss you aside, too." Something inside me snapped. "You don't get to lecture me about loyalty," I said, my voice shaking with emotion. "You were never there for me, not once. Caleb, he's the only one who ever cared." Her face hardened, and for a moment, I thought she might strike me. But then, she straightened, smoothing her jacket as if regaining control. "Fine," she said coldly. "Stay here. Ruin your life. But don't come crying to me when it all falls apart." With that, she turned on her heel and walked out the door. The sound of her car engine fading into the distance was the only proof she'd ever been there. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Caleb stepped beside me, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized it wasn't. Not really. The weight of our choices would follow us, lingering in the quiet corners of this house. And yet, for the first time, I felt free.